but are we underutilizing ministry among the diaspora for the sake of just going somewhere exotic?
I would say that as a whole, the church in the West is not stewarding the opportunity that God has given us in this season. And I see a few reasons why. Typically, it does not equate directly to the bottom line of the church, whether through people coming to the church or financial contribution. Typically in church ministries, I was a missions pastor on church staff, and so I think I have a little bit of insight. Oftentimes, you have this segmentation between like local outreach and global missions. And it's just a really hard struggle to get a church to view local ministry through the lens of global missions. If there's a pastor listening to this, pastor, what if you as a church spent significant time seeking the Lord and asking what your contribution was to the Great Commission, whether it's a people, a place, a process, a project, like whatever that is, and then everything that you do focuses around that.
Hey everyone, it's Steve here at the Living Enviado podcast, and today we're going to be talking about money and missions because I came across this Substack article a month ago. So it was published on March 2nd, and it was called Following the Funds, and it has to do with global remittance and just the amount of money that's flowing around the world and how that connects back to the Great Commission, or how I guess it could connect back to the Great Commission. But the whole article was intriguing because I love talking about what's known as the Silk Road, whether it be the traditional route going from China to Europe, across the Middle East, or whether it's something talking about like a connection point or a corridor for how things move from one place to the next. So there was some terminology in this article that got my attention. And so I've invited the writer of this article to join me. So Bud, thank you for joining me today. Why don't you give us, just a quick 30-second, 36,000-foot view of who you are, so there's at least some context to our conversation.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Steve. Yeah, I currently serve as the director of people group data for the Joshua Project. Came from a field missionary background. Research was a necessity to help me be more strategic and impactful, and just really saw the need to continue that and serve the global body of Christ. And so really, my Substack is where I just take ideas that I'm learning really from just global secular information and looking at it through the perspective of the Great Commission and saying, God has this thing fixed so that he may be glorified among the nations, and he who has eyes to see and ears to hear can ride on the back of what he's doing. So I'm just trying to capture that in the Substack that I write for, but then, more specifically with the Joshua Project from a unreached and frontier people groups perspective, trying to highlight the peoples and places that have the least access and response to the gospel so the church can prioritize her prayer and mission efforts to take prioritized next steps.
So talking about your Substack, I just want to say this. I've gone through several of your articles, and I appreciate a lot of what you write because it's not static. It doesn't come across as just traditional jargon that's coming out of the missions world, but you seem to be thinking as much as possible outside the box, which led to this article, because I haven't thought of it this way. The subtitle of your Following the Funds is What Global Remittance Teaches Us About the Future of Missions. And you related that to the Silk Road. So why don't you just give us a brief highlight of the article, and then we'll just dig into it from there.
Yeah, I think if you just begin to understand and study from a psychological perspective how ideas and influence travel, it travels depending on the kind of cultural perspective with the idea of helps. And so from Western context, help is frequently and often tied to resources. From a more kind of Eastern perspective, it's often on the back of relationships. But what happens in those relationships, either way, is it's a support system. And so when you begin to look at that perspective and you understand that money follows relationships. Within relationships, there's influence. And whenever you think just historically of the Silk Road, what happened, it was through relationships that were founded through commerce that allowed the gospel to go, across the Silk Road. And so just beginning to say, can we learn something from looking at a couple different things, looking at economics, looking at demographics, because demographics are going to inform economics. Economics could be a huge category, but specifically, how is money moving? Because if money is moving across boundaries, that means people have already moved. And so just trying to take all of that and say, okay, what can we learn? And so just some general observations is there are countries that, the Joshua Project would list as, having significant unreached people groups, frontier people groups that are scattered in areas that have increased access to Westerners, to the gospel, to local indigenous believers that may not exist in their home country or their home villages. So there's this access point, but what those people working in Russia or working in Saudi Arabia uh, are doing is they're sending money back. And so there was something else I'd written on was just like this question I had, and actually found some research to back it up, is when a person moves to another country or to a city in their own country, what happens to those relationships in their home village? And there was this interesting study done in Nairobi. So this was in a Kenyan, East African context. But when someone from the village moved to Nairobi, uh, their desire was actually to go back to their village. They wanted to be buried in their homeland. And so what that did is establish this long-term connection with their village. And because money was going back and forth, the people in the village then saw that person as a person of authority and influence. And so it's just this idea of like, what can we have data for to help us inform what God is doing in his world and where the gospel may take root and spread?
So you had mentioned the Silk Road, and I was remembering when I used to live in China. I lived in a city where they considered they have the first known church to be started in China. Of course, it was came by the Silk Road, came from the Persians or Iranians as we know them today, and then and just how it was piggybacking off trade and commerce coming from the Persian world over into China, and it's pretty cool that even the Chinese government recognizes it and has plaques and things of just acknowledging that this was where the first church in China, at least the first known church, was started just outside the city of Xi'an. So I'm curious as it relates to following the funds, because like I said earlier, I do believe this is somewhat out of the box because I don't hear a lot about it. I hear a lot about unreached people groups. I hear a lot about unengaged unreached people groups, and it's always this mantra, we've got to get people excited about them, but it's usually the same song and dance all the time. I don't want to sound cynical about it, but it is the same song and dance. But in your article, you really hone in on the financial part of it, at least, because you did mention, what was it, 650 billion in remittance were sent, around the world in 2023. I mean, that's a lot of money. I know people here who are, from other countries, and like you said, they're working and then they're sending money back home and things like that. So why should we use this as sort of I don't know if litmus test is the right word, but I'll just use it, but kind of a litmus test of where to focus our energies?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be, I'm humble enough to say this is something worth trying. I don't think this is the answer. This is potentially an answer. But when I think strategically about the progress of the gospel among unreached, frontier, unengaged people groups, I think something that has been underutilized, and we don't necessarily have a great term. What I've been calling it is multi-node engagement strategy. And so whenever you think of a community, I call it a people group, a community, in India, I call it a jati, whatever descriptor that you have, it's not based just off of geography. It's a web of relationships. And with modernization, urbanization, technology, those webs of relationship are spread across continents. And you find these natural collection points that provide a hub that then spoke out to villages, to those peoples and places that are, what we call the ends of the earth. But those ends of the earth people have come to these strategic hubs. So like in the US and Canada, you have places like New York, Toronto, LA, that's become this hub of, internationals who have large numbers, who have influence back in their home country. You have places that we would say is traditionally unreached, like in the Arab Peninsula and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And I know of a lot of work happening among South Asians there. And you would think, well, what about the Emiratis? What about the Saudis? Well, that's a unique challenge because the Emiratis and Saudis do not want you sharing the gospel with Arabs. But the unique thing that I found is they don't care what you do with the 3+ million uh, Bengali Muslims that live on the Arab Peninsula. And many of them are sending money back. Many of them actually have tremendous felt needs because they're working basically in labor camps. And so whenever you start to look at how does the gospel take on word and deed in places where people are collecting, that it connects, that's a part of the picture. And so to say, why should someone consider this? What I think a good, robust strategy among a community involves, it involves all of the above. You have a key diaspora node. You probably have a digital node. You probably have a regional city in the country where students from those villages go to study at university. And then you have the village. But I think we're at the point in time where the Westerners' role in missions is still very great, but I may not be the best person to go to the village. Maybe my best contribution to seeing this people reached is through a diaspora node, or maybe it's through that regional city in the country. And then we actually see people from that village take the gospel back. And again, that's following on the back of remittances because those who leave the village, they have really, I would say, in much of the world, a familial obligation because the family has actually invested money to send them. And so it's this expectation that continues. But again, if we understand relationships and influence, it's frequently on the back of money.
So let's talk about kind of what you were describing with the Arab Peninsula, places like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, places like that. And New York City. So on one end, you have places like Dubai where there is a massive expatriate population, kind of the people you're describing coming from all these countries. And largely, I think a lot of them probably do return home at some point just because it's Dubai. But then you transfer to New York City, you've got a place where most of the people who arrive don't go back. I would say, majority wise. So how would you look at it from those two different perspectives? And I may be wrong on kind of what I'm viewing it. It's just kind of what I've observed and, conversations I've had. Because when I used to work with international student ministry, especially with Chinese in the U.S., at one point, I don't know what the number is today, but at one point, 90% never returned home. So how do you deal with, I guess, how do you deal with that in this bigger picture of focusing on the diaspora, hoping that the gospel returns back to their home country?
Yeah, it is a very distinct difference. So like I would say I have more experience in a place like Athens, Greece, than the Arab Peninsula, but I have context for the Arab Peninsula. So in Athens, it's refugees, they're headed to Europe. And so in that context, really what we were seeing was you had a small window of time. And so the thing that would frequently be said is like, we don't know how much time we're going to have with this person. So basically you had to have an evangelism disciple making strategy based off of 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months. And it was just trusting the Lord that what is being implanted in that DNA of the gospel and disciple making will continue. So I would say it's probably in the Arab Peninsula, you have a shorter window. And so that's what you're doing. I also have experience working with internationals in the US. And so just yesterday, I was messaging with a Kurdish friend who's a believer and asking him when he's going back to Kurdistan. And so we were talking about me going and traveling with him to Kurdistan. And so what I've seen as really advantageous from a West kind of back is they may not move back, but they take trips back to visit their family. And so anytime, and this is what I encourage people in the US who have friends from other countries, anytime they invite you to go, take that opportunity. And so I'll give just one example. A friend of mine, Chris, worked in West Africa in Mali, and mud hut, the whole deal, and really struggled to make connections with the people he was trying to reach. Lots of situations happened. He ended up moving to New York City, met someone from the people group he was trying to reach in New York City. And because of the relationship with that person he met in New York City, was actually able to return back to Mali with the relational equity of that person. And because of all of this, how God orchestrated, there's now a gathering among those people in West Africa. And so, without going into a lot of details of that story or the specifics, it is a different strategy. In is it a bridge or is it, oh, let me give it maybe this analogy. Is it a bridge? So like a New York City is a bridge back to a Dubai is maybe like use something that's very, very recent right now. It's like an oil tanker and it's going back without you, but it has the goods. And you're trying to equip it to know what to do when it returns back.
So I like how you're describing the hubs. I mean, you use the word hubs, or I guess you could call them gateways at the same time. And so you've got these centralized locations. So I just get some context for me. So, in my neck of the woods in the US, there's a lot of work of just trying to get people to go to unreached people groups or UPGs. And it's just about going to where the gospel is about getting Americans from here and sending Americans there. But should churches or mission leaders rethink how they're sending or what they're doing to help the church get involved in terms of these hubs that you're talking about, to ultimately, I guess, pass the gospel on to these other places?
Yeah, I want to be cautious in how I speak to this because there is this idea with sending from the West. There's two polars, right? There's this the West doesn't need to go anymore. Let the global South take care of business. Well, the global South is rising to the occasion, but there's still a role for the church in the West. And so we can't go to that ditch. The other ditch is we ignore our brothers and sisters from the majority world. And so that's also a ditch. So we can't take either one of those, but we have to say, what is this middle road where we're using our resources wisely? We're honoring the entire body of Christ with the end vision of seeing every nation, language, tongue, and tribe before the throne. And so what I envision as a way forward is prioritizing the peoples and places that clearly, without any outside intervention, beyond the miraculous work of God, will stay separated from the gospel and the work of God. Then the next layer, so once we identify, okay, who are those peoples and places, then we want to look at, are there natural corridors to other believers besides the West? And so like an example would be, I'll just give a couple of examples. The Northern Caucasus, I know of a lot of work happening among the Northern Caucasus. And so that would be, like Northern Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia, Dagestani area. They're mountain people. They're very isolated. And people on the ground there say, don't send any Americans because it's actually harming the work. They're saying we need mountain people to reach mountain people. And so then you start to think of geographic corridors or linguistic corridors to those peoples. You have an evangelical church in Russia. You have evangelical church in Georgia. And so then it becomes maybe our best contribution as Westerners is to help those peoples who are geographically, culturally, or linguistically proximate have what they need to take on and steward the Great Commission among those peoples. Another kind of piece to that, so we've talked about the Arab Peninsula, so talking about like Emiratis. For me to engage with an Emirati, it's very challenging, right? Emiratis are isolated from, all the 2, 3, 4, 5 million people who are workers. But what we see is you see people from East Africa going to the Emirates and they're working as basically housemaids in the homes of Emiratis. And they're coming from the evangelical church in Ethiopia, from Eritrea, from Nairobi, from Kenya. So they're going, and this is a couple things that we see. So Amharic, if they're speaking Amharic, it's a Semitic language. So then to learn Arabic is much quicker. Culturally, they're closer, but then they're getting into the situation that I would never have. And so then the question becomes, how do we help equip the Ethiopian church to have what she needs to steward and own the Great Commission as they go? You could say the same thing about Filipinos, Brazilians who are going really as workers. And I say workers as in just an economic, not like a cross-cultural worker. How do we help equip them in that process? That's the role that the Westerner can play. But at the same time, there's still a need for the Westerner to go where those corridors don't yet exist, or we don't know what those cultural linguistic corridors are for close, culture mobilization.
I mean, I would agree with you. I mean, I agree that Americans should never stop being involved. I do agree the way you've described it. We just need to rethink how we're involved. It doesn't mean we stop sending, kind of the traditional American missionary out at times, but I do agree that sometimes we just need to maybe pivot where we're looking. And as you were talking about the Ethiopians, of equipping Ethiopians to go to the Emiratis, and you use an example of Georgia and Russia, the evangelical church there, kind of coming between the two toward the mountain people of the Caucasus. And when, as you were talking about it, I was thinking of a question. Like there's definitely, especially in my neck of the woods, there's a lot of work of trying to get, as I said earlier, get people from here to there. So, for example, let's get a bunch of churches mobilized here to go to, let's say, India, for example. But what I don't see in return is I don't see the same mobilization effort among those churches to say, hey, we actually have a very significant Indian population here. Are you coming to the diaspora here as well? I'm not saying you don't go to India if God's opened the door, but if he's opened the door, have you considered also, looking at, the people in your neighborhood? And I don't find that as much. So is the church, and I know I'm being general, I'm generalizing this question. So, poke holes through it all you want. But are we underutilizing ministry among the diaspora for the sake of just going somewhere exotic? Are we ignoring the people here? Like, what would be the problems of ignoring people here if we're just going there, especially when they're next door to us?
Sure. Yeah. For several years, that was really my role, is saying how do we reach the unreached here, mobilize the church to see the ends of the earth reached. And so I have lots of experience, lots of opinion. I would say that as a whole, the church in the West is not stewarding the opportunity that God has given us in this season. And I see a few reasons why. Is typically it does not equate directly to the bottom line of the church, whether through people coming to the church or financial contribution. And so typically in church ministries, I was a missions pastor on church staff. And so I think I have a little bit of insight. Oftentimes you have this segmentation between like local outreach and global missions. And it's just a really hard struggle to get a church to view local ministry through the lens of global missions. If there's a pastor listening to this, one of the things that I have it's been maybe 4 years just asking the Lord to do, and I'm sure this is happening, he's just not let me know of it yet. But I've counseled a lot of churches on mobilization strategy and how they can increase their sending and impact. And I've just been pitching this idea of just saying, like, Pastor, what if you as a church spent significant time seeking the Lord and asking what your contribution was to the Great Commission? Whether it's a people, a place, a process, a project, like whatever that is. And then everything that you do focuses around that. And so I'll just give an example. I'm a people group guy. So let's say it's a people group in South Asia. And you find, okay, this is where the people group lives in South Asia. Here's a little bit about them. But then what I want them to do is I want them to back up and say, what if your first missionary that you send out to work among that people group is in middle school right now? What if they're in elementary school in your church right now? And then every single week, that focus is what you're praying about and through the lens of the Great Commission. For your local ministry opportunities, that is the focus of your local ministry activities, is that people in your city. For your middle schoolers, so like I'll use the South Asia example. very specifically. I have friends in Houston. I'm in Dallas. We have a lot of South Asians, but I have a friend in Houston who will take middle school church teams to work among South Asians. It's like, what if you sent them to Houston to work with South Asians? And then I have friends in New York City who are working with South Asians. Like, what if you sent your high school students to New York City? Then I have friends in Athens, Greece, working with South Asians. Like, what if you send your college students to work among South Asians in Athens, Greece? And then what if God is just working inside someone that whole time, just building a passion for this people, like the passion that perseveres, and they're actually the first people that you deploy as a church. And so, like, as a pastor, like that would just give me so much joy to know, like, I shaped that. Where in reality, as being a missions pastor and then being sent from a church, frequently that's not what happens. It kind of happens in a parallel track, and it's not necessarily in unison with the church. And I just find that as a little bit of a gap. And I think something like there has to be vision casted toward the ends of the earth, but saying, what has God given us in our backyard? And are we stewarding that to the best of our ability? And then the final thing I'll say on this is then if you have workers who are in that context, when they come back on stateside or they come back off the field permanently, they become just an injection to that local ministry because then they can start training more distinctly about worldview. They know, hey, here's really how you connect with their heart. They know where all the resources are. So once you have that kind of continuum from, local, kind of national, international, home country, it just creates this synergy. And then really it captures that same idea I'm talking about, this multi-node engagement of saying one is probably not good enough. How can we get engagement in all of these different types of access points?
So a lot of what you're describing to me, there seems to be a lot of effort within medium to larger size churches, at least generally speaking, in missions. So I guess in this question, speak to like the small church, whether it be 200 or less, 100 or less, 50 people. I do find that a lot of them don't know how they can be involved, or they just think they can't because, they've only got a few people, they're limited on resources, they claim. There's always a reason why. But, let's take the 50-person church.
I'll give a brief example, and then I'll just really shamelessly promote something that's really a gift to the body of Christ, I believe. But just an example, I have a friend who's in a small church in North Carolina, and his church has been involved long-term in a Central Asian country. And this is a church of, I don't know the exact number, but it would be considered a small church. And they're making a tremendous impact because they have a visionary leader who's stewarding it and the church is behind it, but they're focused on catalytic activities of mobilizing others, getting others involved. And so some people may kind of understand or know the terminology of like a strategy coordinator, just like helping find all the resources God has and then directing them toward that vision for that people. I think small churches can operate like that, where they don't have to carry all the weight, but what they can be is catalytic in seeing resources allocated, people sent, and saying it's not about our name being on it. And I think that's a benefit of a small church. I don't see any small church saying, I want to put my stamp on this. They're just serving faithfully, but they've frequently not seen a method or a model where a small church can make a tremendous impact. But I would say the church in Antioch was a small church that made a tremendous impact. Why? Because they heard from the Lord and they let go of people and resources. Now, specifically, how could a church, medium-sized, large, small, any of them get involved? So one thing that we are launching, and I say we at the Joshua Project, is people group adoption. The idea of people group adoption is not like paternalism, and I know that that's carried sometimes with adoption, but it's really this beauty of saying, we have, the best of our knowledge, over 3,200 frontier people groups. These are groups that have less than one Christian out of every 1,000 people. And, most of the people that live in those groups will live their life and really not have a relationship with a Christian. So these are the groups that have the greatest need for outside help. So the idea of adoption is we have adoption facilitators, which would be local, regional, national, or international, or Western sending structures who have either workers among that group or a commitment to send workers among that group and help facilitate. Then on the other side, you have churches, small groups, even families who say, we want to commit to this people group. And then all we're really starting to do is be a matchmaker. I'm saying, local church in Oklahoma, you have a heart for the Pashtun people of Afghanistan. Well, let us connect you with ministries who are on the ground or who have been on the ground or who have contacts with people on the ground who, one, can tell you, here's how you can very specifically be praying for the Pashtun of Afghanistan. Here is how you can support financially. Here's projects that are specific. You're not starting, so you're already joining what has already been started. And again, some things just need to be started, but frequently there's already things in place, people close that really they just need an additional undergirding of prayer. They need to know they're not alone. But what this also does is allows sending pathways. If the church wants to send someone, short term or long term, depending on the context, all of that opens up, and we're just trying to be a matchmaker. So we have this adopt acrostic. So ADOPT. Let's see if I can get this right because this is new. So the first is A, which is awaken. We just want to see the church awaken to the reality of frontier people groups. D is, I don't remember if it's discern or decide. I think you get the idea. What is God calling us to as a church, small group, fellowship? O is orient, meaning I need to learn about this people. I don't just decide. I need to really understand their worldview. P is pray. Obviously, that's foundational, but we don't want this just to be a prayer campaign. The T is team up, and it's two-part, team up and take action. And so that's what we're trying to facilitate. We really just have this big vision of saying, can we see 100,000 people group adoptions among these 3,200 plus frontier people groups? And what could God do as we mobilize prayer, resources, and people and make connections, right? Because a friend of mine was, some of your listeners may know David Garrison, know his works, but he says if the body of Christ knew what the body of Christ knows, the body of Christ would know what it needs to know to complete the Great Commission. And we're just trying to help close this relational and knowledge gap from the field into the church.
So that David Garrison quote is like a tongue twister, really.
It really is.
Yeah, I know some of the people he's worked with in the past. So I'm just curious, let's just circle back to your article for just a second. Like maybe you've already answered this to a degree, but what do you believe the church is missing anything by ignoring migrants and kind of these hub places? Do you think they're missing something if they don't pursue that?
Yeah, I do. I've made a case in the past that the local church is missing the vibrancy of the global church if they're not willing to embrace the foreigner among them, right? So if you think of Acts 17, Paul at Mars Hill, he talks about that God establishes the times and boundaries that people live so that they may seek him and so that some may find him. He's not far from any one of us. And just from my own experience, especially in the US, so like I've done the research, the majority of migrants that are coming to the US, whether as refugees or immigrants, they're Christian. They're from Christian countries. They're Christian in name. They may not be, vibrant evangelical faith, but they're Christian. We have something to gain by being in fellowship with them. So that's the first part. The second part is I have gained so much as a follower of Jesus by being around Arab Christians from a Christian background, Arab followers of Jesus from a Muslim background. And I just see a lot of our internal challenges in the church in the West. Having brothers and sisters from other parts of the world, part of our fellowship, gives a different perspective and it softens our heart. It lets us have more understanding of what God's doing. And that's just from the church health perspective. But I think we're really missing the opportunity that God gives us whenever he's bringing people who have been separated from the gospel, who they have not necessarily rejected the gospel. Many have, but many have just not heard it in a way that makes sense to them in their language and through their worldview. I'll just give this one example and I'll wrap this part up. I have a Bible study that I lead with some guys on a Friday morning at a Panera Bread from different churches. One of the guys is a pastor. And so I saw him last Friday, and this was the Friday after Easter. He said, "Bud, we had a Muslim show up to our church on Sunday." I said, "How'd that happen?" He said, "One of our people invited him." And he just showed up and he says, "What's Easter?" genuinely, totally unaware. And he just want to know what is this about? This is the problem. And the brother I'm talking about, he knows my heart in this. They weren't prepared. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to answer his questions. And I was like, brother, that's a gift from God. And so now I'm trying to go follow up. I know he works at this Arab coffee shop, so we're gonna go visit him. But the church, like, I hear that story, like, and I'm in a city with a couple 100,000 Muslims, but that happens. And we're not even prepared for when they come to us, let alone saying, how do we help our body who are living among, working with, studying beside Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and Jewish peoples?
I want to give people the opportunity if they want to connect with you, or specifically, I guess, with Joshua Project, that may be better. I don't know what you would want with that, but how could they at least connect with Joshua Project if they want to learn more about unreached people groups or engaging, or even some of the things that you talked about today?
Yeah, so Joshua Project, our website is joshuaproject.net. That'll get you to our homepage. You can explore frontier and unreached people groups. We have a new prayer map. So like if you just want to take a next step for praying, you can do that. And then I'm trying to get the URL. I think it's just joshuaproject.net/adopt. So if you want to explore further what adoption is, joshuaproject.net/adopt. That would be the primary place I would want to point you to if you just want to explore, hey, what is your prioritized next step in missions? That's what we do, is we serve the church to help her take prioritized next steps in missions. If you want to follow my Substack or subscribe, maybe you can put the link in the show notes, but my Substack is called Clarity for the Nations. And just the idea is there's a lot of information out there. And what I'm just trying to do is just help bring some clarity to some of these information pieces so that, again, so that people can take prioritized next steps in missions.
Hey, thank you for listening or watching. And on whatever platform you're on, hit that subscribe button and follow us. And don't forget to go to YouTube, especially if you're on YouTube. Comment. We would love to engage with you on this specific topic or any topic, or just let us know what topics you would love for me to talk about, or types of people you would love for me to interview, and I will consider it. I will take it into consideration. I fully and I deeply appreciate your feedback. I appreciate your engagement. Don't forget to share this with 5 people, and in this case, maybe 5 churches who need to hear about this topic, about what Bud was talking about with the Great Commission and how churches need to be involved. And I hope it will encourage you to expand your involvement. So until next time, get out there and live bold, live courageous, and live Enviado.